All right.
Hello, everyone. So nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Elsner, and I'm CEO of the San Bernardino County Medical Society. And I'm here today with our other staff from the Medical Society, as well as our amazing guest speaker, James Muir, whom we will introduce in just a moment. We appreciate you tuning in today to listen about our exciting presentation, Denial Trends Decoded, Turning Data into Dollars for Physicians. And this is, of course, presented by our preferred business partner, UnisLink, in conjunction with SBCMS. So what we'll do is go ahead and have James present to us. We will be glad to take any and all questions. Feel free to enter those into the chat as we go along. As you think of them, just enter your question. We can also have you ask them verbally or by raising your hand at the end of the call, but we can field them that way at the end of the call. And please keep yourselves on mute if you aren't talking. All right, everyone. I'm excited to introduce James Muir, who is a 30-year revenue cycle expert, having led revenue cycle teams for Conifer, NextGen Healthcare, AVAAP, and many others. James is a highly respected growth leader, best-selling author, speaker, and seasoned revenue cycle expert, specializing in leveraging process and technology to improve financial performance for clients and personal value for their stakeholders. James has done extensive work for some of the largest names in technology and healthcare, including HCA, Tenet, Catholic Healthcare, Banner, Dell, IBM, and others. Throughout his career, James has focused on helping leaders in healthcare think through and overcome their big business challenges and to reach their personal goals. So with that, we will turn it over to you, James. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Allison. You are a wonderful hostess. Let's see if I can get our presentation on the screen. If you guys can let me know if you can see that, that would be awesome. Are you able to? It should say denials decoded.
Looks fantastic.
All right. Well, great.
Yes.
Well, Allison, that's a wonderful introduction. And I promise you guys are all in a wonderful treat. And I mentioned this earlier before we started. This is a very highly educational session. So if you're here to learn something new, I promise you're going to be very, very happy with this session. So Allison's already introduced me better than I could have introduced myself. So all I'm going to say is my mission in life is just to make the complex things in life simple. Right. And so that's what we're going to do today is I'm going to simplify the whole denial management process for you. With that said, let's just jump right into it. Here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to spend a minute on current industry challenges and trends when it comes to denials. We'll talk about what we're going to accomplish on this session together, but you're going to come out with some new skills, I think, that you didn't have before. We're going to spend a minute talking about remark codes and reason codes, how to use those to work your denials and also prevent your denials. And then we'll talk about how to measure your denials using key performance indicators. Then we're going to dive into some different strategies that you can use to manage those denials, right, with less resources. That's going to end up falling into three categories: people, process, and technologies. We're going to explore all three of those together in the time we've got. And then finally, we'll conclude, and I'll share a way that you can get some help looking at looking at your own denials and looking at your own financial performance. So if that sounds like a good plan, get ready because here we go. When I go to these kinds of sessions, I really like to get some kind of data that's hard to find. And so I wanted to give you that payoff early in this session. So what you're seeing on the screen right here is the most recent data on what's the initial denial rate by payer. That's what you see in the orange right there, right? And so on the left, you've got all of our major payers here sorted from the highest to the lowest. So not surprisingly, we see UHC at the top with a shocking initial denial rate of 32%, followed by Medica with 28%, and then you go on down the list, right? In years past, Molina, especially their HMO plans, have all had very high denial rates, like 30%. So they all take turns being at the top of this list, right? And a lot of these plans have actually had class action lawsuits filed against them for their high denial rates. Right now, both UHC and Cigna have been sued recently for using AI to deny Medicare Advantage claims. But the truth is, Humana, Blue Cross, CVS, Aetna, many others have been sued for very similar reasons. And I've even personally testified before the Arizona Congress on this exact issue. And maybe I should just be transparent for a minute. I just believe that the insurance companies, because of the nature of the relationship that we have with them, are inherently evil, and that these lawsuits, they're needed to help keep payers honest and force them to serve their members in the way that they've agreed to do. Okay, so transparency, back off, I guess. On the right, what you see in the blue there is what the average initial denial rate is by category. And so now we're just looking at like out-of-network commercial, in-network commercial, Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, managed Medicaid, and so on. But all in all, initial denial rates from payers have been steadily increasing over the past few years, where today, shockingly, nearly 1 in 5 insurance claims is actually denied. Okay, so right now, that initial denial rate, the average initial denial rate of across all payers is between 16 and 20%, which is absolutely I've done this and kept eye on these statistics for years. This is absolutely the highest that it's ever been. Now, MGMA and Experian are both really good sources that you can use to keep an eye on for updates and denial related trends. According to their surveys, here's what their respondents are saying. 73% of them are reporting that denials are increasing. Not all that surprising. 77% report that policy changes are happening more often than they ever did before. 67% say it's taking longer to get paid on average. And more than half of them are reporting that even when they do pay, they're paying it wrong, right? Which means we have to spend a lot of effort trying to resolve those. So on average, all 4 of these particular categories that you see are up over 25% since last year. So the whole problem is getting worse. This table shows the categories where the increasing denials are showing up. And not all that unexpected. Administrative errors are at the top of the list. And we'll talk more about this later. But these include things like, incomplete or missing information, stuff that's our fault and not necessarily the payer's fault. But modifier rules fall into this category too. And payers very often make arbitrary changes to their rules. So often, in fact, that what might have been working just fine last month suddenly just stops working this month because of some change has been made on the payer side. Okay, next up, we see medical necessity is up over 15%. We all love pre-auths, not surprisingly, that too is up over 13%. The 4th category with the biggest change is excluded services and policy issues. That's basically just covered benefits. Okay, and we're going to talk more about that here in a minute. But overall, since 2020, denials have increased between 15 and 23% on average. So how are we at appealing those claims? Okay, well, I know this is going to blow your mind, but this statistic has actually remained very constant for many years. In fact, I just vetted again before this presentation. And a full 66% or 2/3 of all claims are actually never appealed. Okay, and by the way, if you look at consumer claims, it's even worse. Only 1% of consumer claims are ever appealed. Okay, now the good news is that when we do appeal a denied claim, on average, 54% of those are overturned. Okay, so in a minute, we'll talk a little bit about, well, why is it that so few claims are appealed when at least half of them are going to get overturned, right? But again, it's a very shocking statistic. And what I would say is the reason that payers deny claims is because it works. If 2/3 of them never get appealed, then they've found an easy way not to have to pay. Okay, so here's some interesting facts on the denial appeals process itself. First, the average denial appeal takes 3 interactions with the payer and takes on average between 30 and 60 days. Okay. In fact, a denied claim can take 2 to 6 months to resolve completely, right? Of course, that affects our cash flow every time something like that happens. And then I think they'll be most interested in this one. The administrative cost to work a denied claim ranges between $25 on the low side to as high as $118 on the high side. And so if you just average that across the board, the average cost to work a denied claim is $43.84, or in short, it's about $44. And we're actually going to use that number in this session to give you some valuable information about your practice. Okay, so what are the financial implications of this? Well, it mainly affects 4 different areas. First, it decreases cash flow, right? It delays payment by 30 to 60 days, even when we are successful at getting an appeal overturned. Second, we have a much higher risk of non-payment altogether. And then as we just witnessed, it increases our administrative costs because it's costing us on average $44 every time we have to work a denial. And then lastly, I'm not even sure everybody's aware of this, but when payers don't pay, it leads to patient dissatisfaction, and that ends up rubbing off on the provider not necessarily the payer where it ought to be. And according to data from the American Journal of Managed Care, denied claims lower patient scores by 8.2%. And then there's data from McKinsey that shows that how we handle our accounts receivable with patients has almost as much impact on the patient sat as does their interaction with the actual physician. Okay. And what that means is that these really high industry rate of denials that we're seeing is actually artificially lowering provider quality scores across the board because it's making the patients unhappy, and that rubs off onto the provider. So it does vary quite a bit by specialty, but all in all, monetary losses due to denials ranges between $75,000 to as high as $200,000 a year per provider. Okay. So what are some of the trends that are specific to California? Okay. Well, there's a couple, but it's really kind of more accurate to say that they're really essentially the same challenges that we see other places. It's just worse in California, actually. And so the most notable and a little bit encouraging development is that there's a bill that is in Congress right now in California called SB 363. And that legislation would require payers to disclose high denial rates or just facts, statistics around the denial rates and provide detailed reasons around every claim. But what the cool thing about the bill is it proposes penalties of up to $1 million per case if more than half of a payer's denials are overturned on appeal. Okay. And my opinion is, I don't know who created this or submitted the bill or wrote it or anything, but I think that that's meant to discourage payers from using denials as a stall tactic, which we all know that they do. Right. And I think it's noteworthy, at least in California, that as of right now, 72% of appeals to the California Department of Managed Healthcare are reversed. 72%, not the 54 that we saw, right? So definitely payers in California use denials as a stall tactic more so than in other states. And then most of the rest of these we've already talked about already. So we'll just keep moving on here so we can cover all the content. But to be frank, these are all really considerable challenges. And so I thought, man, before I throw you all into a fit of depression here, let's just quickly touch on why we're having this session together. Okay. And that's just to understand what denials are, how to measure them, and then how to identify what the root cause is for each denial, and then talk about some effective strategies on how we can address and prevent those. Okay, all with the goal of improving our financial performance for the practice. Okay, so let's start with just a little bit of education here. And I'm sure most of you already know this, but just in case there's somebody new in the audience, let's just quickly go over the difference between reason codes and remark codes. Okay, and so whenever we submit a claim and there's a denial, we're going to get a reason code that explains why it was paid differently than the way we billed it. And those are called claim adjustment reason codes, or CARCs. Okay, they're all standardized and used across all payers to communicate claim processing outcomes. And very often, we're going to receive something that's called a remittance advice remark code, or a RARC. Okay, and that provides additional information about the adjustment that was described in the reason code. Okay, but in short, the way to keep track of these separately is a reason code explains the core reason for a claim payment adjustment, and the remark code gives us clarification about that adjustment. Okay, so if it was missing info, the remark code would have the missing info in it. That it says, oh, you didn't have this one piece of information, and that's why we denied it. Okay, both of them are part of your remittance advice, your ERAs that you get from payers, and they're meant to help us understand the claim outcome and guide us into the whatever follow-up actions, so appeals, corrections that we're going to take next. Okay, and since they're standardized and used across all payers, I wanted to give you a list of all the most common reason codes, or CARCs, issued by payers. And you can see here, they all follow this little nomenclature, right? They all have a code and then a description with them, right? And the nomenclature, and I probably should put this on the screen here, but you can write this down. So it has 2 alpha characters and then a numeric value. And a CO means contractual obligation. If you see PR, it means patient responsibility. If you see an OA, that means other adjustment, and a PI means payer initiated. Okay, and they're all mandated by HIPAA. They're part of the ANSI X12 standard, and there's over 300 of these codes. And I'm pretty sure that you probably recognize most of the codes that you're seeing on this list. And we're actually going to come back to these here in just a second. Now, the remark codes are also part of that mandated HIPAA ANSI X12 standard, and the nomenclature for a remark code is a leading letter followed by, it's 2 to 4 digits, and then whatever the remark is. So M is typically, it stands for Medicare remarks. Okay. And then N is just non-Medicare. Okay. Informational remark codes are all going to begin with this phrase. It'll say alert, right? For example, you might see one that says, alert, if you do not agree, blah, 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 you can appeal this decision. Okay. And all in all, there's over 400 total remark codes, and they do vary per payer. And so just like the reason codes, I just wanted to give you the most common remark codes that you might see. You know, I'm sure you recognize these all too well. And again, we're going to come back to these in just a second. And then for reference, I just wanted you to have the top 20 denials by frequency. And here they are, right? And of course, every practice is unique. So yours are going to be a little bit different than these. But this is a good reference info and a pretty great place to start if you're not sure where to start. Okay. And that lets us transition into how we're going to measure this stuff. Okay. And I'm going to give you a number of key points throughout our session together today. And this is the first one. And that is this: key performance indicators, good or bad, can always be traced back to operational issues. Always. Meaning that key performance indicators are really just indicators of our operational performance. Okay. And a common phrase that I say at least 2 to 3 times a day comes from Peter Drucker, who says, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Okay. And just to the nature of what we do here, I talk to practices several times each week who are struggling to identify why their performance is down and they're looking for some kind of help. And what I would say is the best place to start is with your key performance indicators, right? KPIs are going to point to the areas where you need to dive deeper. And now that sort of begs the question, okay, James, I get it, but what KPIs should I be measuring? And I'm sure, again, you probably know most of these, but here they are. And the one that we're going to look at today is our denial rate, okay? And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how to calculate denial rate, what the root cause typically is when it's outside the normal range, and then we're going to use these KPIs to improve our financial performance. All right, so here's a skills building segment here, okay? So your denial rate is the percentage of claims that are denied out of the total number of claims that you sent, right? But there is a little nuance, and that's because denial rate all by itself is not a sufficient KPI, because we're going to appeal a lot of those claims, and a lot of those are going to get paid. So we actually need to track 2 different versions of this metric. We need to track initial denial rate, which is the percentage of claims that are denied by payers upon first submission, and then final denial rate, which is the percentage of claims that still remain denied after we've appealed them all and all of our efforts have been exhausted. And the benchmarks for these we saw earlier, right? 16 to 20% of all claims are denied initially. So that's our, on average, that's what the initial denial rate is going to be. Although we even saw some that were as high as 30%. Okay. And then the industry benchmark for the final denial rate is somewhere between 2 and 5%. It is possible to get this number less than 2% when you're performing really, really well. Okay. So virtually every other key performance indicator in your practice is going to be affected by high denial rates. If you have high denial rates, every other metric is going to get affected. Now, how do you calculate it? Well, there's 2 formulas, and you can see those right at the top. Okay. But your initial denial rate is simply the total number of denied claims divided by the total number of claims that you submitted, right? That's going to give you a percentage. And then our final denial rate is very similar. The only difference is that you're going to start with the number of denied claims that are still left over after you've exhausted all of your efforts. Okay. Now, here's the unfortunate truth. A lot of practice management systems are just not very good at reporting denials. And sometimes you can work around that by using Excel and pivot tables. But if necessary, you might consider getting some of your denial data from your clearinghouse, because very often they'll have reports that will tell you these percentages. But because of the way a lot of systems report denials, you have to keep an eye out for accidentally counting duplicate claims. And that's because a claim actually might get denied, a single claim might get denied multiple times, right? So very often, the way we have to address that is you dump them all into an Excel pivot table, and then you group them by your encounter number or your visit number, so you're not accidentally double counting your claims, okay? Initially, what you should do is just calculate your denial rate as a percentage, just like we saw in the formula there. And then as a second step, you can run, if you want to, what's called a dollar-based rate, which calculates based on the value of the denied claim. And the percentage is really better for benchmarking, and the dollar-based method is kind of better for showing what the financial impact is of your denials, okay? So how do we analyze and report this? And the thing is if you're not careful, and especially if you have a lot of denials, analyzing denials can feel a little bit like boiling the ocean. And remember our key insight, right? All key performance indicators can be traced back to operational issues. And that is especially true when it comes to denial. So the good news is you're never going to get any better operational feedback than you are going to get from analyzing your denials, right? It's absolutely the best. The bad news is nearly every operational issue that you have is going to surface in some way in your denials when you start going through them. And so that means that we're going to need some kind of a process to start analyzing our denials. So we're focusing on the areas that are going to give us the most bang for our buck. And so here's a process that I recommend. We're going to calculate our KPIs. We're going to look at them and analyze them. Then we're going to prioritize them by importance and impact. And then we're going to implement our improvement initiative to try to prevent that denial from coming back. So let's look at an example, okay? So once we've identified our initial and our final denial rates, we're going to want to trend them to see, is it getting better? Is it getting worse, right? What direction is it heading? And then from there, we're going to want to break the denials down in several ways to help us identify where the issues might be happening. And these might include things like service location, right? If you have multiple locations, then you want to run your denials by location. And that's going to help us identify if there's operational issues at any particular location that's contributing, abnormally to our denials. We want to break it out by payer and financial class. That's going to let us know if any given payer is guilty of overly contributing to our denials. And then we're going to want to break it down by service item, CPT, service grouping categories, right? And the goal of that is just to help to see is there any particular service line that we're doing that is overly contributing to our denials, okay? And then lastly, we're going to look at the actual denial code and the category. And so here's an example of what a denial breakout looks like by reason and by category, right? And we can see here in this example that registration and authorization are the two biggest denial categories here, right? And that gives us a place to start. But when I see something like this, I start to ask myself, well, yeah, but what payers are associated with these denials? What CPTs are involved, right? And so my mentor, Mohan Khalsa, would say, start anywhere and go everywhere, okay? And so here's an example looking at all of the categories we just talked about, right? Denial code, CPT code, location, payer, right? And denial category. And there's a lot of data here, but the first thing that jumped out at me when I saw this is that our denial for Medicaid is extremely high, right? It's 27.22%, right? Right down in here. And so I thought, oh my goodness. Well, so let's take a look at those and drill down on that and figure out what's going on. So when we drill down on that, we can see that the main culprit is this CO 197 right here. And that is a missing pre-authorization. Okay. And we can see some office visits here too, right here up at the top. Okay. And we also see quite a few 17110s, which is a skin lesion removal. Okay. And we see that it's happening in most of our offices, but it's happening most in our Houston office. So this is an example from Texas. But most of the other offices have issues with it too. So now we've kind of got enough information to start suggesting an improvement intervention, right? We know that there's something about this process that when they do a skin lesion removal, they're not getting the pre-auth like we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to fix that one, and then we're going to move on to the next one. And so basically the process we're going to do is we're going to prioritize by impact and importance. We're going to find the biggest offender. We're going to figure out what the root cause is for that, and then we'll go on to the next one. And you not only do you want to pay attention to your worst offenders like we just did, but you also want to pay attention to the best cases too. Because if we went back to that previous screen, you'd see that the Dallas office actually doesn't really have a problem with the authorizations that the other offices have. And so that makes you ask, well, I wonder why that is. Maybe there's some kind of process that's working in the Dallas office that the other offices could use, and then that would make our problem go away, right? And so all of this information is going to give us the leverage that we need to gain the support of leadership for an improvement, some kind of improvement initiative, okay? And then lastly, I would just say, just know, by the way, that this process literally never ends. The payers are incredibly resourceful when it comes to finding ways to delay or not pay. And what that means is we're going to have to be vigilant forever, right? By keeping an eye on our denials, okay? So here's another skills building segment here, right? And this time we're going to use your practice metrics to calculate the cost of managing your denials, okay? So how much are my denials costing me? And that's the question we're basically answering right now. And if we were doing a workshop, we have more time, we would actually do this all together. But what you're going to do is you'll see a QR code, and I'm going to give Allison that handout that you see the image of on the right that has all these formulas in it. right? But I'm going to show you a spreadsheet on the next slide so that you can just type it in, and she'll have that spreadsheet for you as well. And so at the end of this webinar, you're going to get a recording, you're going to get the deck that you're seeing now, and you're going to get these other two assets that will help you figure this out. Okay. But what you see right here is a screenshot of a spreadsheet that incorporates all of those formulas. And we're going to use this as our example so you can sort of get your head around what is the cost of working denials. And this is real data from a good-sized primary care group in California. Okay. So if we look, you can see that the average annual encounters, I'm just walking down this list right here, but you can see the same numbers right over here, they're doing about 57,600 encounters a year. Okay. And that the average revenue per encounter for this group is $131. Okay. And that's pretty good, by the way, for a primary care group. We can see that their initial denial rate was 14%, which is a little bit better than average. And then we're just going to use the industry average for the recovery rate, which is 54%. Okay. And then we're also going to use the industry average cost of working a denial, which in this case is $43.84. So using the formulas that you just saw on the previous screen that you'll get in your handout, that means that the average or the value of the annual services for this group is about 7.5 million right here. Okay. And 14%, which is the denied amount of 57,600 is 8,064. That's how many claims are getting denied, right? So those are the ones, that's how much we have to work. Okay. And when we multiply that number times the average revenue per encounter, we get the value of those denied claims. And that's this $1 million number that we see right here. Okay. Then we're going to multiply our 8,064 denied claims by the average cost to work a denial, which is $44. And that gives us this about $350,000 that we're doing that. So if we appeal all 8,000 of those claims, we can expect that maybe 54% of those will be overturned. And so we can see what the expected recovery will be for those denied claims. And that's about $570,000. And then finally, if we subtract the cost of working the denials, that's this 350 from our 570, we end up with the net gain of working our denials in-house, which is about $217,000. Okay. Now, hopefully all of that is making sense, but let me just make a couple of observations here, right? First of all, this is a pretty well-performing practice. I mean, they have a better than average initial denial rate. They have a better than average ARE, or average revenue per encounter. And yet, this group is still spending $350,000 a year on denial work, okay? And then next, I don't know if you found it, but when I use this example, I don't know if you found it shocking. I find it shocking that out of $1 million of encounters, that our ultimately recovery was only about $200,000. And so the takeaway from that little principle is that denial work is expensive, right? It's best just to avoid it altogether. But denial work is expensive. But the sad thing is that's a lot of money, right? That we can recover this. So we can't just ignore it either. And so, and finally, I would just add that this group is indeed getting to all their denials, meaning that out of all 8,000 denials that we see right there, they're getting to all of those. But I do several hundred assessments every year. And what I can tell you is that it is actually very rare for practices to be able to keep up with their denials. They're almost never keeping up with that. The workload is just too much. And so if you wanted to know, for example, how many FTEs this group had, you could just take that $350,000 it's costing them to work denials and divide it by your annual bill salary. And that'll tell you how many FTEs this group has just working denials, right? And most groups, unfortunately, run much leaner than that. And as a result, they actually don't get to all their denials, okay? Now, the good news is that once we have this data, we can start comparing all the different possible interventions that we might take to start improving our denials and try to figure out which improvement initiative is going to be the best one for us. And that's what we're going to talk about next, okay? So, but before we dive in, let me just make you a promise, right? Imagine for a minute that you didn't need to work all those denials, right? Because 95% of your claims were just going clean the very first time, and there was really no need to suffer through the appeals process. That's our goal, right? And my personal philosophy, by the way, we want to maximize our effectiveness by just preventing errors and rework to begin with, right? Get it right the first time, do it right, do it once. And so here's my promise to you guys. If you improve your denial rate, it will have an absolutely massive impact on your overall financial performance. Like I mentioned before, it will improve every other KPI that's happening in your practice. So the rest of our time is going to be spent talking about how do we actually go about doing that. And how do we do that, by the way, without adding a ton of human resources? So let me start by sharing you an insight that you already know. And that is that of all the things we can do to address denied claims, prevention is the best strategy, bar none, bar none. Rather than getting really good at working denials, it's better just not to have a denial to begin with. Okay. And here are the reasons that we were looking at before. These are our CARCs. Okay. And the truth is 90%, maybe as high as 95% of all denials are completely preventable. Okay. Now, it is true that some denials aren't preventable, but the vast majority of them are. And what you see here is a list of some of the most common denial reasons, the CARCs we were looking at, and whether or not they're preventable. And can we prevent eligibility and coverage issues? Yeah, of course we can. Can we prevent incorrect or missing, procedure codes? Yes, of course we can. Can we prevent coordination of benefit issues? Sure, we can do that, right? All we need is the right processes and maybe a little bit of technology to help us do that. And so that's an important insight. The majority of denials that ambulatory clinics face are preventable with just improved administrative processes and maybe a little bit of technology. All right. So, and again, that's a philosophy I recommend that you adopt. And that is we want to maximize our effectiveness, not efficiency, but effectiveness by preventing errors in behavior. Again, get it right the first time, do it right and do it once. Now, an extension of that would be to adopt the sort of a zero tolerance mindset when it comes to denials that you see are preventable. When you see one, you're like, we don't accept that around here, right? Right? Like when we could have prevented that. And so when we see a preventable denial, we want to systematically explore what the root cause of that is, and then create some kind of intervention to prevent them. And where appropriate, we need to make certain people responsible for that prevention accountable, right? And so this might be the most valuable slide in the whole presentation. But here's the truth. The only long-term strategy for permanently eliminating denials is just to prevent them from ever happening in the first place. And in order to do that, you have to be able to get to the root cause and prevent it. In order to do that, you're going to need to implement a denial review process that is measuring the denials that you're getting and prioritizing them, right, by impact and importance. So we're starting with the denials that are going to have the greatest positive impact on our financial performance. And unfortunately, this rarely happens, especially in smaller organizations, where the same person who's doing the appeals is also expected to be the person that's providing the feedback. And you'd think it would work, but it's just too much work. 70% of all practices are understaffed in this one area. And because of that, what happens in real life is your staff members that fully intend to get to root cause, they want to do it, right? After they're finished working denials, they never get to it because they're never able to get caught up with the denials. And so they end up on this endless treadmill where they're never able to get to analyzing and preventing root cause. And so the only way to get off the treadmill is to dedicate resources specifically for that purpose. That means that's that person's only job. They don't work denials. Their job is to prevent denials. Okay. And for a lot of organizations, that's tough medicine because it's an additional expense. And for that reason, it almost never gets put in place. And so they end up on the treadmill forever. Okay. And so what you see here is kind of a simplified model here of how this would work. But over here on this side, you see sort of an abbreviated version of the revenue cycle process. And then when we get a denial, we're just going to put it in one of three buckets: coverage issues, coding issues, and then everything else. Okay. And then maybe we see something here, like let's say it's something that we can fix with a modifier, or we see something wrong with the J code counts or something like that. Great. Then our person who's going to review that says, hey, I think we should just add a claims edit to the system to prevent those from going out so we don't have to get a denial. Then we implement that, and now our feedback loop is complete. And then the next time we go through a different one. And we just keep doing this month after month after month. We keep on iterating until we've addressed all the root causes, right? So it's a systematic improvement process to make sure clean claims go out the very first time. If you do this month after month after month, eventually you will get your final denial rate down to less than 2%. Okay. Now, when there is some kind of an intervention, it's most likely to end up in one of three categories: people, process, or technology, one of those three things. And so what we're going to do with the rest of the time that we got together is just explore how we can leverage these three areas to try to prevent our denials. Okay. And ideally without adding a lot of human resources. Okay. So the first question that people usually have when it comes we're going to talk about people first here. Okay. So, and usually the first question people have is, well, how do I even know if I have enough people or not? Right? And that is a very good question. And so we're going to answer that question is you need to look at these three key performance indicators. We're going to look at our revenue realization rate, our insurance over aging AR over 120, and then we're going to look at our accounts receivable days in that order. Okay. And so let's just start with revenue realization rate. And to be candid with you, I don't know. I don't know why they call this a realization rate, because it's not really an indicator of how much revenue you realized. That's not what it is. What it is it's the percentage of charges that are either collected or written off, regardless of the reason. Okay. So even if those charges were all written off to bad debt, they're still included in this formula. And believe it or not, that's useful. Okay. And we'll see why that's useful here in a second. But when you calculate this for 90 days or more in arrears, the benchmark for this KPI is between 99 and 100%. Okay. And that's just another way of saying that after 90 days, we should have gotten to everything, right? All the claims, payments, adjustments, one way or another, we should have got to them all. Okay. And the formula for calculating revenue realization rate is just total payments plus total adjustments of all types, right? Including bad debt, divided by total charges. That's it, right? And what this metric is good for is telling us whether or not we're able to keep up with all the work we have. And that includes claims processing, payment posting, denials, etc. Right? Is everything getting processed and getting completed? And when we're not, that number is going to be less than 99%. Okay. And again, just because of the nature of what I do, I see several hundred of these every year. And I will just tell you that this number in the majority of practices that I see is less than 90%. Okay. In the majority of the assessments that we see. And that's just an indicator that most practices today are running way too lean, and they're having a hard time keeping up with all the workload. Okay, so that's our first of the three indicators. The second one is our AR over 120. Okay, and the formula for that is very simple. We're just going to take the total value of our AR over 120 days and just divide it by your total AR, right? And that's going to give us a percentage that's less than 1. And what you're looking for here is something between the 9 to 15% range. But there's a special nuance here. We need to break this out by patient AR over 120 and insurance AR over 120. And that's because that little difference helps us more accurately identify what the root cause is of what's going on. And what you see right here is real data from an assessment that I did about a month ago. And what you see is that an incredible 93% of total AR is still out to payers, right? Right here. Okay. And then even when we go all the way out to past 120 days, okay, which is plenty of time for the payers to have paid, we still see an incredible 85% of AR over 120 days is still out to the payers. Okay. And that is a really big indicator that our staff is not able to keep up with all the denials and the requests for additional information that's coming back from the payers, right? And so what's terrible about this, by the way, is that for most practices, the majority of the patient money that they collect is coming after the insurance is processed. That's usually when not many groups are collecting the patient balance before. They'll collect copays only, but not the full balance. And what that means is our inability to stay caught up on insurance issues inadvertently also affects our ability to collect the patient money too. Okay. All right. So that's your second indicator. And our third indicator is days in AR. And days in AR is just the average number of days it's taken our practice to get paid. It's a metric of cash flow. And a lot of emphasis is placed on this metric, and a lot of people think it's the most important. And that's because, when you're doing everything else right, it really is a very good indicator of the overall efficiency of the practice, right? The lower the number, the faster we're getting paid. And the benchmark for this is around 30 days. And the formula for calculating day in AR is simple. It's just total accounts receivable divided by your average daily charge amount. But here's a little warning about this. This particular KPI can be gained. Days in AR can be gained. It can be low because you're operating really efficiently, or it can be low because you're writing off a ton of charges, right? And that would be bad. And so in the context of evaluating your staff's ability to keep up, that's why we make it the third KPI and not the first KPI. Okay. And then because the truth is, it's easier to write off a balance than it is to appeal it. Okay. So when staff get under pressure, a lot of times they become much more liberal about writing things off rather than going through multiple rounds of appeals that's going to take 30 to 60 days. All right. And that's why you need to look at all three of these KPIs to get a clear picture of what's going on. So just to recap, the revenue realization rate, run 90 days in rear, is our first best indicator of our staff's ability to keep up with workloads. Insurance AR over 120 is our second indicator. A large percentage of AR over 120 that's still out to payers is a really big indicator that the staff's not able to keep up with the workload coming in. And then days in AR, when everything else is done properly, is an indicator at how fast our AR is getting resolved. And so a high AR over 30, AR days over 30 can suggest that our staff's unable to keep up with workloads. Again, in the context of evaluating the sufficiency of our staff to address denials, AR days is subordinate to the other two. You want to use it third, not first. Okay, so let's keep moving here. What are some of the people strategies that we can employ though? Well, our top strategies is going to be improve staff competency, right? We can train them. We can make them more efficient and effective at what they're already doing. And that can include processes like workflow training or front-end processes or claim submission workflows, denial management. There's a bunch of things that we can just train them to make them better. If we have coders, or maybe even if our providers are doing their own coding, we can get them education, right? We can maybe require certification, or we can implement CDI training. Of course, it's perfectly legit to hire more staff if that is warranted, okay? And then, of course, if we're having a hard time doing that, we could consider outsourcing some of our functions so that we can gain access to the talent that we don't have internally, right? All of these are legitimate strategies. But here's a couple of tips if you're considering hiring new staff. First of all, Indeed.com is a really helpful resource for estimating what your expense might be for any given position in any given market. Okay, for example, you can see salaries here from 2 different revenue cycle positions in the Los Angeles market. And it's worth noting that hiring a quality AR coding staff has been reported by MGMA as the top challenge for like the last 3 years, 3 or 4 years actually running now. And then the other thing to think about is it does take a considerable amount of time to hire revenue cycle specialists. On average, someone with 0 to 5 years of experience is going to take you about 84 days to hire. And someone with 10 years or more experience, a really experienced person, is going to take you over 200 days. And so it's just something to take into account about how long can you go. All right, so let's talk about process a little bit. Okay, and when we're analyzing our denials, we're going to break them down by functional area so we can try to pinpoint the root cause. And remember, the reason we're doing that is so we can prevent it, right? So we never have a denial again. And what you see here is a table that has the top reason codes, right? The CARTs that we looked at earlier, placed into the functional area categories where they typically originate. And that gives us an idea of where we need to go in the practice to start our improvement initiative, okay? And you're going to want to implement the best practice process for your practice and situation, okay? And again, we could do a whole multi-day workshop on best practices alone, but what you see here is some reliable places that you can go to identify what those practices are for your specialty and your practice, okay? And with every process, the problem with using the term best practice is you get this feeling like there's only one way to do it, and it's the best way. And it's better to think of that as good, better, best, right? So it's a spectrum, not just an all or nothing thing. And so, for example, when it comes to collecting patient money before service, good might be collecting copays at the time of service. Better might be estimating the patient's responsibility and using a cheat sheet or something, right? And collecting it before service. Best might be using an electronic estimation tool that looks at your payer contract and exactly how much of the patient's deductible has been met so that it's accurate, and then collecting it before service, right? So every process that you've got is going to have a good, better, best. And it's possible you might not be ready for the very best practice right now. That's okay, right? Just implement the process that you're ready for that still prevents the denials that you're getting, okay? Then move on to the next one. And what you see here is some processes that you can start reviewing in your practice for possible upgrades. Okay, all right. You're going to want to have some standard operating procedures for every process that you have. Okay, and a standard operating procedure is just simply a set of detailed step-by-step instructions, right, that help your workers carry out all their operations in a consistent and efficient way. And it should identify the goal of the process. It should say who all the stakeholders are. It should document very clearly, right, and concisely all the steps that are. It's good to use like diagrams and screenshots when you need to. It should document who's responsible for what, and it should be distributed to everybody in the organization that needs to know about it. Okay, and I want to give you a cheat code for this, okay, because an absolutely fantastic resource for you to either start or upgrade your policies is a book by Elizabeth Woodcock called Operating Policies and Procedures Manual for the Medical Practice. And it's in its 5th edition right now. I promise you, in almost every case, if you already have this all built out, it will get you 90% of what your policies and procedures should already be right out of the box. You can just cut and paste it, and then you can tweak it from there, right? So, and again, this was also listed in the best practices resource site. So this book is absolutely worth getting. Okay, so let's transition to everybody's favorite part, which is the technology part. So your practice management system is literally the most foundational piece of technology that you need to address and prevent denials. So a good EHR/practice management system is going to come with a lot of workflow and time-saving elements already built into it. And again, we could do an entire session on PM systems, and I don't want to do that. So, but yeah, what you should look for is in a denials prevention context, some things you should be looking for, like, automated eligibility checking and verification of benefits and the workflows that go with that, right? You're going to want sophisticated claims edits and the ability to customize those edits for your unique things that you're seeing in your market with your payers. Okay. You want a good denials reporting and analytics. Like I said, a lot of systems don't do very well in that department. Some systems will have a denial management system already built into them, which is nice. A workflow system for allocating work and secure messaging between employees is important. Document imaging is helpful. Coding assistance and coding calculators is helpful. Customizable EMR templates for your doctors is good. And pre-auth and automation workflows also very important, right? And it might, by the way, it might seem weird for me to mention EHR templates when we're talking about denials, but if a provider orders a procedure that requires pre-auth, there's going to be some extra questions that are going to have to be answered before we can get the pre-auth. So it's really helpful to be able to prompt the provider for those questions right at the time they order the procedure or whatever it is. So, and if they get them right then there's a lot less back and forth and delay, right, with the provider when you're trying to get the PM. So again, your PM system is a very, very big component of your denial management program. Okay, so let's talk specifically about eligibility checking and verification of benefits. And like I said, they do hundreds of these rough cycle assessments every year, and absolutely the top denial reason in almost every case is eligibility and benefit related. Okay, so unless you have that licked, I recommend that you start there because it is a 100% preventable denial. And most practice management systems have this feature built in. But let me point out something that a lot of folks miss, and that is there's really a very big difference between checking for active coverage for a patient and verifying that the service you're about to perform is a covered benefit. Okay, those are two different things. And so a lot of systems will automatically check for active coverage on a schedule, but they don't verify benefits. Okay, and so if you're getting a lot of coverage related denials, that's a really important thing. And so what you're looking for is a solution that can return a complete 271 benefits file, not just active coverage. And that should, it doesn't always, but it should contain a summary of the patient's benefits that you can use to verify the benefit coverage. Now, most systems cannot, today anyway, cannot read and verify a benefit coverage file on their own. AI is rapidly changing that, but for now, you should probably still plan on having a person actually read the 271 response to confirm coverage. Okay, and then finally, even if you do all of this, the truth is sometimes the 271 doesn't contain the benefit coverage reference that you actually need for your practice. And that means that your process will still have to include sometimes going to the payer portal, even calling them to confirm benefits. Okay, now, one of the most critical features for your practice management systems is your claims edits. Okay, sometimes you hear this called claim scrubbing. Okay, and a claim scrubber is just an automated system that scans the medical claim to detect and correct any errors or inconsistencies that might cause it to get denied. And there's actually several different places where edits are performed throughout the billing process. And so what this image is it's describing those, and that's because it can become confusing. But the first is we have claims edits on your practice management system, okay? And since not all practice management systems have really robust claims edits, we will sometimes employ a third-party claim scrubber that has more sophisticated edits, okay? And then next, you've got the clearinghouse edits, okay? Now, the clearinghouse itself is going to have its own own set of edits, that are going to run on your claim before they send the claim to the payer. But they're really very basic. They're looking for missing information type of edits. And when they trigger, you're going to get something that's called a rejection. And a rejection is not a denial. It's a rejection from the clearinghouse because the clearinghouse knows that if they send it on to the payer, it's going to get denied. So it rejects them for you. It's like a benefit, right? They're trying to help you so you can fix that problem before you get your denial. And the percentage of claims that make it past the clearinghouse is called your first pass clean claim rate. And that number should be 99 to 100%. That's what your first pass clean claim rate should be, 99 to 100%. Okay. If it's not, again, this is one of the first places you're going to want to start with your improvement initiatives, right? Because these are just basic information, missing information type edits. Okay. And then finally, the claim goes on to the payer. And of course, payers have their own set of edits that they use to adjudicate the claim. Okay. Now, less mature practice management systems are going to have weaker, or in some cases, they don't even have claims edit systems. And they rely heavily on clearinghouse edits. But remember, unless you purchase some kind of special practice from your clearinghouse edits aren't very sophisticated, and it will miss a huge number of issues if you're relying solely on that. Okay, for time's sake here, I'm going to skip this slide, but just getting a little more granular, if you want to look at very specific things that claims edits look for and that you want to make sure your claims edits do, this slide is meant to do that. And so you're going to get this deck after the session is over. What you see here is a basic practice workflow when it comes to processing claims edits, okay? And so once a claim is entered, it's going to go to our claim scrubber where it's either going to pass or it's going to fail. If it passes, awesome. It's going to get submitted to the clearinghouse for payment. If it fails, it's going to trigger a workflow where it's reviewed for correction. And that correction is then made, and then the claim is resubmitted for payment, okay? Now, the best practice is to review all the edits for root cause so that we can prevent the edit from ever happening again. And that root cause is typically one of these 8 categories, which you see over here. And that's going to trigger an improvement issue or initiative on your part to prevent the issue from ever happening again, right? And so you got to remember, this whole thing happens before the claim even goes out. So for sure, you want to go to school on your denials, but if you can actually go to school on the claims edits beforehand, that's an even better place to trap it because it's before the claim ever gets denied. Okay. All right. So let's keep moving on here so we can talk about some of the other things. One last thought on claims edits, and that is, where does AI fit in? And there was a whole new breed of claims edits out there that are starting to use artificial intelligence to identify and help even create new claims edits. That is, that they learn from the claims that get denied, and then they suggest what type of new edits should be created to prevent submission of that claim that we know is going to get denied, right? It's going to fail. So there's also a new breed of AI learning that once a claim edit is triggered, rather than having it reviewed by a human, the AI can often fix the problem itself, okay? And we use some of that technology too, but we're not going to go into that in detail, but you can see the 2 different types of edits compared here. The very short version is that AI in this area is emerging, but it is not perfect yet. So we really can't turn everything over to the robots just yet. Who knows, maybe 2026 will be the year that happens. All right, continuing our theme with using technology to prevent denials, probably the hottest area in AI development right now is using AI to do coding. And I'm very happy to say that the AI in this area is getting very good, and it's definitely worth exploring. Okay, there are some limitations that we'll review in a second on the next slide. But what you see here is a comparison, of what I thought you might be considering, and that is, well, how does AI coding compare with my human coders? Okay, and I've broken that into 6 different categories for you: accuracy and consistency, speed and efficiency, complex cases, cost and resource, compliance and updates, and then workflow integration. And I want to be sensitive with our time here so we can answer some questions. So I'm not going to go over this slide in detail, but you're going to get the slides. Rather, what I will say is that the promise of AI coding is looking very good right now, and that you can get, if you can get a quality engine at a good price, that it's absolutely worth exploring. Now, AI is sort of one of those topics where it can often get blown completely out of proportion as to what's really possible. And so people will sometimes get the impression that it's like this holy grail for everything. And that's not what it is. So what this slide is meant for is just to give you a little dose of reality so you don't accidentally overestimate AI's potential. And what I find interesting is that most of the challenges with coding are actually inherent within the coding dynamics itself. It doesn't really matter whether it's a human coder or whether it's a AI coder. They all have problems with the same things. And so those dynamics don't change whether you're a human or a robot. And what you see here is sort of a reality check comparison between AI coders and human coders that I thought you'd find useful. So first is the reality is that both AI and human coders rely on the quality and the completeness of the clinical note, right? If your clinical note is terrible, both of them are going to struggle with that. Okay. Second, both AI and human coders do very well with routine cases. In fact, accuracy is statistically the same between them, so there's no winner in that category. Next, both AI and human coders require interpretation and judgment for ambiguous, complex, and unusual type cases. And right now, the edge really belongs. Human coders are better at this than AI is. Okay. Continuous learning. Both AI and human coders require continuous learning and updates through training. Okay. And so every specialty has to be trained, or new rules have to be trained. And they need AI particularly needs huge numbers of cases before it can actually learn. And and this may come as a surprise, but both AI and human coders require oversight, right? They require quality checks, and so you can maintain their accuracy and the compliance. AIs make mistakes too. And so we don't want to just turn it on and let it go unattended because you could get a runaway problem. On the availability side, because AMA is reporting about 33% shortage in coders right now, AI is absolutely winning in that category, right? So we can install it. Now we have availability of coders. On the complex cases right now, AI struggles with rare and complex cases. And like I said, that's because the AI needs a large sampling of data of similar examples in order to learn from. Without it, it forgets stuff, it makes mistakes. And so human coders are really better for that right now. On consistency, AI does better. It doesn't have off days, the same way a human coder can. And then one of the most important elements is vendor dependence. And right now, AI coders are highly dependent on the vendor for their updating, right? So if a vendor gets behind on updating their AI rules for let's say the 2026 coding guidelines, then your coding is going to be behind too. So you got to make sure that you've got a vendor that's supporting what you need there, right? All right. And knowing that a lot of you might want to explore this after this session, I want to just give you a cheat sheet of some of the stuff you should be looking for when you're researching an AI solution. So you can see those here. You're going to get the deck. I'm just going to call out a couple, and that is you need to make sure that you're getting automated updates for your coding guidelines. Like I said, you don't want the AI learning from all the denials you're getting from your coding update, right? It should be proactive. They should be loading those rules for you beforehand. Second, pay attention to how the workflow works. Make sure there's an efficient way to validate how the AI came to its conclusion, and a way to have humans review that and address things when the AI's confidence in its coding is low. Vendors should be guaranteeing you at least 95% accuracy or better, because that's what you can get from certified coders, right? And then lastly, you should vet the vendor for viability and long-term sustainability. You wouldn't want to invest in an AI vendor and then have the AI vendor go out of business, and then there'll be a loss on your part. Okay, so man, we just covered a lot of stuff. Okay. So I know that's a ton of ground. I promise you it was very educationally dense. Okay. So let's just summarize a couple of the key points here. First, claim denials, huge problem, and it's getting worse, unfortunately. It's costing between $75K and $200,000 per year per provider. It's not going away anytime soon. Our only solution is really just to become excellent at preventing and managing our denials. Second, know how to measure and report your denials, right? Know how to calculate your initial and your final denial rates. Know how to use your data to identify root causes and identify possible improvement initiatives. Third, prevention is the best strategy. Okay, so create a denial feedback root process in your organization and get to the root cause, and then prevent the denials so you don't have to spend a ton of energy just working denials. And then finally, you can use some of the strategies that we just talked about in people, process, and technologies to prevent and address the root cause of your denials. And that's it for the content. I know, because I've done it, how challenging it can be to start down this road alone. I mean, we do several hundred of these a year. And so if you would like some help identifying your denials and possible interventions, we are happy to help you with that. And because of our relationship with SBCMS, you don't have to pay for that. Our partnership covers that for you. So if you would like that, you can just snap the QR code that you see on the screen, or if you'd rather use that little gibberish looking URL at the bottom, you can use that. There's no charge for it. Again, it's our way of supporting SBCMS. And so all you do, it'll take you to a form, you just fill it out, and then there's really not a lot you have to do after that. We'll take care of almost everything. So it was great being with you today. Allison, if we have any extra time left over, I'm absolutely happy to do any Q&A that might be come up during the session.
Well, James, as always, that was amazing. And this will be super useful to everyone. We're not seeing any questions at this point, but as maybe people think about some questions right now and get them entered in the chat, can you repeat again for us this process on the free revenue cycle assessment? We've got the QR code. Tell us again what you will do for folks for free.
Okay, yeah. So again, what's funding this is already a relationship has been set up with SBCMS, right? So you don't have to worry about paying for it. But what it is we'll pull some data from your system, and then we'll analyze. It'll have about 25 key performance indicators in it. We'll identify maybe up to a 30 or so risk areas. This will include your denials. And so that information will be given to you, and we'll identify places where you can improve. We'll make a bunch of recommendations for you. I did Epic Consulting for many years, and we used to charge about $10,000 for the same thing that we're doing here. It will be between 50 and 70 slides in length. And if you want, we could do another session at some point where we can go over what one looks like. But it's very valuable. And again, there's no charge. It's just our way of supporting SBCMS. And I know how tough it is. And there's no obligation either. It's just you'll take a look at your practice. You'll learn a lot of stuff from it. Maybe you'll take away some actionable things that you can do and go apply it. It's a great process. And I mentioned before, we do several hundred of these every year. So we're good at turning around fast. You don't have to do much on your side, because we have a specialist that already knows your practice management system that will pull your data for you. So they pull it, they put it in a secure folder, and then our folks take a few days to massage that into something that's meaningful, and then we just got a time to review it together. And then when you're done, we'll give it to you.
That is absolutely unbelievable. And a $10,000 value. I mean, yeah, people could not easily pay for this on their own. So this is a really, really critical service that you're offering. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And again, it's our way of supporting SBCMS.
Well, we are honored to have you as a business partner. Truly, you really offer a lot of benefits here and, depth of value. So I have a question, not seeing any others in the chat, but, you were talking about billing staffs and physician practices conducting their own kind of analysis of their denial rates and that sort of thing, and calculating the loss. I realize this is why they need you to help with this, but are billing staffs capable of doing this for the most part? Because that probably requires a lot of time, as you referenced, that there is not a lot of people are being overtaxed in the practices from the staff level, but are they able to do this, or generally do they need some coaching on this?
Well, there are certain reports that are harder to run than others to get your key performance indicators out. But I think honestly, pulling the data is doable for almost everybody that's running a practice. Where you get a big benefit is someone who can turn that into some really meaningful insights, so that you, instead of being lost in your data and thinking, what does this mean? You've got someone who's been doing it for a long, long time to say, when we see this, it usually means this, right?
Okay.
And then usually what happens, we just ask a couple questions, say, did something happen in May? And then they say, oh yeah, that's when this happened or that happened, right? So, but you'll get a lot of insights from that. So I guess, there's a lot of value in getting all the information distilled. Like I just did one earlier this morning, and that practice was planning on sharing that in their board meeting with their all their providers, right? On their board. So it's good for that. But where it's a little trickier is, how well you can distill the insights from the data has a lot to do with how many years you've been doing this, right?
Right.
And so I think that's where we add a little bit of extra value is we'll pull the data so you don't have to bother with it. We'll show you how to distill it. And if you wanted, Allison, we have a whole webinar that tells you how to make your own. So
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
we would be happy to do one of those for you.
Okay, that might be fun for an upcoming webinar, along with the others we talked about that you're going to do on specific types of denials. We have a lot of plans in the works with UnisLink here to educate all of you. So we appreciate that, James. I'm not seeing any other questions, folks. Is there anything anyone would like to ask? Do you want to raise your hand and ask or
Last,
comment?
last call.
No. Last call, just like an auction. All right. Well, James, I think you've answered everyone's questions that they had during the presentation, and you've covered a lot of terrific ground here. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for you and UnisLink, what you bring to our physician community.
Yeah, amen, Allison. Thank you. It's great working together.
All right, we feel the same way. Absolutely. So everyone, we will keep you posted on our next upcoming webinar with UnisLink. And just a reminder, we do have a mixer coming up with First Citizens Bank. And that is, what is that date, Janice? February 12th, I think. Yes. And so we're going to be, we've started distributing some invitations for that. But for those of you physicians on the line, we hope you will join us at that for a financial checkup, as well as just some amazing networking. All right, everyone. Well, have a lovely rest of your afternoon and week. And we will see, and happy Valentine's Day coming up. And we'll see you all very, very soon. James, thank you again.
Pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.